Hello, Charles Mercier here. Let's look together at another good object from the Greek and Roman galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Or rather, this time, 9 good objects. In the Met's vast Greek and Roman galleries, it's easy to see the rich and powerful elite of the ancient world. It's harder to see traces of the lives and experience of slaves, the enslaved persons who were always there working, but in the background. Ancient Greece and ancient Rome were slave societies. A large part of the wealth and leisure enjoyed by the elite was produced by enslaved persons, human beings held as property, violently dominated and without legal rights. Over the next 3 videos, we'll look at some objects at the Metropolitan that allow us a glimpse of the experience of slaves in the Roman world, even learn a few of their names. These are 2 oil lamps from Roman Cyprus made of terracotta from the 1st century CE. Lamps in the ancient world burned oil, often olive oil. They were small containers for the oil that burned on a wick that floated in the oil. These are factory-made lamps, not expensive. If we look closely at them, we see they are decorated with images of slaves hard at work. On this one, an enslaved person is kneeling in a confined space, wearing just an apron or loincloth, doing some work at a large basket or bowl. On this lamp, we can barely make it out, but there are 3 enslaved persons moving right to left, lugging something heavy above their heads. It's so heavy, it takes 3 of them. Maybe it's an amphora, a storage vessel, and they are loading or unloading goods to be transported. It's apparently comforting in some way for slaveholders to see depicted on their household objects images of the slave labor that supported them. Liverpool in England was a center for the modern transatlantic slave trade and a place where you could manufacture and market pro-slavery tableware. This is a tea and coffee creamer in the British Museum from 1793 in Liverpool, which shows a ship that transported slaves for the slave trade. This creamer approves of the slave trade, against abolition. It wishes success to the slave ship Brooks and its captain Clement Noble, just at a time when the cruelties of the slave trade were coming under greater public discussion in England. In the United States, from the 1880s until recently, the figure of a mammy, an enslaved African-American woman, Aunt Jemima, was the brand name and advertising image of a pancake mix. The light and the darkness that oil lamps provided to an ancient world without electricity was a luxury, one of the many provided by the benefits of slave labor. Another object at the Met that connects the luxury of light at night with slaves is this small sculpture of a servus praelucens, the slave that waited for you outside while you were at a party and then carried a lantern in front of you as you walked home at night. There's a lot to say about that, so let's save it for the next video. This is a drinking cup made in Arezzo in Italy in the 1st century CE. It was made by a slave named Rodo. As a pottery-making artisan, Rodo perhaps did work a little more rewarding than the slave we saw who was kneeling at the bowl. Rodo did gain a little recognition for the artistry of his work. This pottery technique is called terra sigillata. It was a high-quality Roman tableware with a glossy red finish and with decoration on it. The Etruscan town of Arretium, modern Arezzo, was a lively center for manufacturing this kind of pottery from mid-1st century BCE into the 1st century CE. We're seeing other examples of this kind of pottery that's on exhibit at the Metropolitan. The factory that made this cup was owned by someone named Publius Cornelius. Cornelius was possibly a descendant of a former slave, a freed person, of the family of Cornelius Sulla, who had come as colonist to Arretium. Arretium had supported Sulla's enemy Marius in the civil war of 87 BCE and had had a veterans colony imposed on it. Publius Cornelius had a pottery factory. Its products have been found in Italy and have been found exported to military sites in Germany and to the Western Mediterranean, particularly Spain. Factories didn't have employees, they had slave laborers. Publius Cornelius had something like 40 enslaved persons working in his factory. We know some of their names from the maker's marks stamped on them. The factory had an identifying stamp that sometimes also named the slave who made the piece. This is an example of a stamp of another Arretium manufacturer on the inside bottom of a cup. When Cornelius acquired his factory, he acquired the slaves that came with it. We know the names of some of them from the maker's stamps. The names perhaps tell a little even of their stories. There are Greek names that perhaps reflect the Greek themes in some of the decoration. Eros, love. Anteros, love in return. Phileros, lovely love. Attique, woman of Athens. Antigonus. And some Latin names. Gemellus, little twin. Germanos, brother. Inventus, foundling. Infants in the Roman world were often exposed, and rescuing abandoned infants was one way to acquire a slave after you paid for keeping it alive until it was old enough to work. There were some other slaves that Cornelius purchased after he got the factory: Antiochus from Antioch, Heracleda, Faustus, lucky, Primus, first, and Rodo, who made the cup we've been looking at. This is a marker that a woman named Satria Epicharis put up as a memorial in the early 200s CE for a young slave she was fond of, who died young. Dis manibus Antoninus vixit annos duodecim, Satria Epicharis vernae suo bene merenti fecit. Making it easier to read, Dis manibus Antoninus vixit annos duodecim, Satria Epicharis vernae suo bene merenti fecit. To the gods, the manes, or to the spirits of the dead person, or in memory of the dead person. Antoninus lived 12 years. Satria Epicharis fecit, made this monument, for her verna, who was well deserving. A verna is a homegrown slave, a slave who was conceived and born in the household. In English, we get the word vernacular, native, one's native language or architecture. Enslaved persons, of course, could be bought at the slave market, but another source was a slave woman of the house getting pregnant. Slaves, of course, had no legal standing to marry, but the master could allow a relationship between two slaves, a contubernium, or the master could impregnate a slave woman himself if he wished, since he held a legal prerogative over his slaves in every way. Slave status came from the mother, the status of the father was legally irrelevant. Sexual abuse and rape was a possibility in the production of homegrown slaves. To be homegrown might have given a slave some sense of well-being or status in his or her household. To have grown up without freedom might have made a verna less rebellious or resistant. A verna had not known any other condition and had not had the traumatic experience of capture, losing freedom, and being sold. Satria Epicharis had an emotional attachment to Antoninus, whom perhaps she had watched grow up from infancy in her household, and so arranged this plaque for him, though it's not very expensively made or elegant. Memorial inscriptions for vernae often mentioned their death at a young age. Raising a homegrown slave was an investment. Money the family spent on food and nurture, keeping a verna alive through infancy and childhood, while too young to work, was a financial risk. When Antoninus died, aged 12, Satria's family may have loved him like a pet, but had not yet gotten their money's worth out of him. Thanks for watching.